Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Primer sharing webinar from the first workshop, which occurred at DLF back in October. Thank you for all of you for staying with us with this. And we're going to start with the Geodatabases Primer.
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure everyone can hear me. So I can go ahead and start.
Yeah.
All right. So my name's Anobi, and I am part of the group that was authoring the geodatabases with Andrew, Tom, Jennifer, Carrie, and our mentor was Mara. And so, So one of the things that so a geodatabase is a proprietary kind of file format from ArcGIS, our Esri ArcGIS, and so it's very popular because that's a popular geospatial product, but it's not necessarily easy to curate. So our curation components were the curation that we recommend for this type of file is actually a full transformation of the data. So not to get rid of the geodatabase, to keep the geodatabase, but also to transform all the files within there into more common files. So things like vectors into shape files, rasters, make sure they're all geotiffs, tables, make sure they're all CSV. We're not actually, we recognize that there can be code, and we do discuss that, but, and Esri actually has some information for how to export that into kind of a Python script, but how to actually keep that, any input would be greatly appreciated. And why do we recommend this full transformation? It's because shapefiles, geotiffs, CSV are much more accessible to a variety of programs than a geodatabase is. So geodatabase is only able to be opened by ArcGIS. It can be opened by QGIS, but we don't really know if it's a really long-term sustainable product like these other things are. And then there's issues of accessibility. So not just people being able to access them, but there are some issues in the transformation of the ArcGIS package, which we talk about in our primer. So they've just done a major revamp of the whole software. And so this can cause some issues of actually being able to get to the data. And then as far as the metadata, in our document, we have an overview of two of the most common kind of geospatial standards, which are this ISO 191XX and FGDC CSDGM, very, rolls off the tongue, metadata schemas. So one of the things we talk about in our document, so we actually talk a lot about, once you read through the document, you'll see there's a lot of discussion, but we talk about how these metadata schemas are not really known to researchers who are actually collecting this data. And so that becomes an issue. And the software captures some basic metadata, but it's not capturing a lot of this kind of full, complete metadata. So we have that marked as something to flagged for the archivist, the curator, so that they can go and ask these types of questions. And then Andrew actually wrote up a lot of our metadata section. He has a really great discussion about geo-blacklight as a solution for some of these metadata issues, because it doesn't require all of these fields. You can do it ad hoc, so you can put a lot of information in there. So that discussion is a really nice overview of, here are the metadata standards, here's the issues with them, here is a possible solution for archivist. So are there any questions on that aspect of it? If not, we can go to the next slide. So this is my attempt to be clever. So highlights, so the reason we have the Monopoly Man here holding the Esri symbol is that Esri really has a monopoly on the geodatabase format. It's made for Esri, and they don't really want other people to be able to get access to it. So a lot of our primer actually discusses how a geodatabase is structured and how it's structured for hiding that kind of information. So how the file structures are actually hidden. You can't actually see what files you are unless you're in ArcGIS. And how there's a big change to ArcGIS Pro and how that's affected things. So for example, Python code that was written in Arc Desktop that's like pre 9.2 version doesn't work in the latest version. It has to be rewritten because they've changed, you know, the major formats in that. And so we've tried to highlight all of those problems, or as many as we could, for the curator. And we've actually turned those into questions for the curator. So make sure you know what version this is, because if you open it on this version, this is what's going to happen. It may not work, or it may say it's working and it's not actually doing what it's supposed to be doing. And you might not know what it's supposed to be doing. We also, I think we did a really good job of the shape file is the most common file people think about with ArcGIS and vector files, but there are a lot of other types of files that go into geodatabases, like rasters. There can be scripts. It's actually really annoying because you can accidentally store PDFs and JPEGs in there and never know they're in the geodatabase unless you go to the File Explorer. So we try to take the consideration of this beyond just the shapefile and how do you assess the raster? How do you assess the code? What would you need to know to do that? And then we try to put in there, we have a short kind of table of the why researchers would choose geodatabases and the challenges, right? So our document is basically trying to prove to everyone, don't use geodatabase for curation, but you're going to have, they do offer benefits to a researcher. They're all about trying to make these data smaller so that they're easy to render on a computer. They're easy to store for the researcher. So we're trying to have those questions in there so that you as a curator can understand what they are doing and address those kinds of questions. And then the last thing is the discussions of how the geodatabases work, right? So, you know, what's going on, how are they structuring the files, what do they actually look like to the researcher, and like how can you kind of tease out that code. So yeah, so that's our primer, and we hope that you all enjoy it and that you can give us good constructive feedback on it.
That was wonderful, thank you. The next group is going to be Netcdf, and Sophia, I believe, is not here, so she's going to be represented by Susan Borda.
Did I mess up the share? Sorry, did it disappear?
Go off, yeah.
Okay, there it is. Thank you.
Hi, Cynthia and Hannah. I'm actually here.
Oh, great.
I'm glad you could make it.
Yeah, no problem. So hi, everybody. I'm Sophie Howe. I am the sole author of Netcdf, but I have two great mentors. I have Jake and Susan, and I've been working with both of them. And the Netcdf, or Network Common Data Form, is the focus of my primer. And as you can see on the slide, this primer is actually a supplemental primer to an existing primer that the Data Curation Network has already produced. And in particular, the original authors were Sam and Susan. And so I was able to leverage the information that's already been available, or that's already been made available from the main primer, and grow on top of that. And the reason why I was really interested in this topic is that Netcdf is actually developed by Unidata, which is part of the UCAR family. And I am currently at the National Center for Atmosphere Research, which is the other branch of UCAR. And we utilize this data format really frequently, not only within our research community, but whenever we are helping people in archiving earth science-related data sets or atmosphere research-related data sets, we often use Netcdf as an example of what we call the self-describing format, and wanting people to leverage the capabilities of Netcdf so that the file information can be more complete and can be more understandable to the end users, and ultimately, obviously, to help in promoting the usage of the data that's contained within these formats. And from the main primer, there are already a lot of great background information about Netcdf, and there are 3 key questions that were included as the key questions for curation review. And basically, the main primer suggests that we really should take a look at how the Netcdf files are organized, and how thorough is the embedded metadata in the headers, and what steps were involved in producing these Netcdf files. There were also 4 different tools that were already suggested that one can use for curation review. So what I did in this supplemental primer is I actually took a very unique reanalysis data set from the NCAR family or NCAR community, which is and is produced in the Netcdf file format. And I went through the steps in the main primer to demonstrate how the main primer was really helpful in terms of helping someone to curate a Netcdf file format. And finally, the last bullet point is about another tool that is also available for curating Netcdf files. And Susan and I have actually discussed this, that this portion will be moved into the main primer. We haven't done that yet, but just for the because of the current flow of the main primer and how the supplemental primer is going to be attached to the main primer, we feel that the new tool information should be integrated with the main primer, so that the information will be more compatible that way. And so currently, so next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, so currently the version of the primer I've submitted includes these 5 different sections. I basically gave a quick background information on the main primer by jumping into the research data archive where I got the sample data set from. And then I explained to the potential users of the primer how to actually follow along to get this sample data set. And, and to make sure that the users actually get the same results that I am presenting, there's also a sample visualization that the potential user can compare with my process to make sure they did get to the right place before they start the curation process. And then the 4th section of the primer basically answers the key questions from the main primer using Panoply as the curation tool. They were, as I mentioned, there were 3 other tools that were also discussed in the main primer, but Panoply is one of the more popular ones from the NCAR community, so I felt that was also a good endorsement for the tool. So I used that as an example of how to go through the data content. And then finally, the last section I have, as I mentioned, will eventually be moved over to the main primer, is the information on the integrated data viewer and how to actually install this tool, where to get it, and how it presents the Netcdf information once you're able to install this tool. And so finally, the version is available in the folder that we were asked to submit the information to. And like the previous team, I'm very excited to share this information with the community, and I hope you all be able to take a look at it and give me feedback, and I appreciate any comments you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophie. That was great. The next group is going to be Jupyter Notebooks.
Hello. So I'm Dana, so I'm presenting there.
Cool. We hear you, Dana. Go ahead. Just let me know when you want me to advance.
Move on to the slide. So I honestly didn't really realize that we were going to have, I don't know, a little more time to talk about these things. So I just threw together some slides. So I hope you actually just go kind of after I'm done talking and actually read the primer, because essentially we so myself and my co-authors, including Sophie, who just spoke, hi Sophie, spent some time putting together what we hope is some guidance on working with these somewhat complicated and atypical objects. And so I have some questions at the end that you all can hopefully get I don't know, help inform next steps on this primer. But Jupyter Notebooks are essentially kind of composite digital assets made up of made up of a Python .pynb file, in addition to a web app and a kernel to actually run the whole file and system so that you can actually execute things within it. And these are used for actually sharing all kinds of stuff. People use them for sharing visualizations, for sharing code, for sharing equations, documentation. They're usually interlinked with other things. So they're usually a supplement to something else. But I guess we can move to the next slide because that's kind of my big point here is that, okay, so Jupyter Notebooks are, God, sorry, not used to not driving. But Jupyter Notebooks are executable. So that's something that makes them different, I think, from a lot of other objects because they're meant to be interactive. They're meant to be the kind of thing that you share and then someone else can pick up and they can adapt it. And ideally what you want to be able to do is actually examine all of the code that is written within it. And so I've been working with a couple of different groups doing a lot of work on metadata for code. And so I saw that that's a comment on on the R primer. So I'd love to talk to people who are talking about the R primer. But we need to treat these things differently from data, quote unquote. So I guess next slide. So code is not data. I want to if I could make this bigger and more bold, I would, because this is confusing to people. I find that when I actually talk to researchers who write code, the idea of treating this like data or any other thing that you can make static to be really challenging for people. So if you were to think of this kind of like a recipe or something like that, you've got ingredients and that's kind of your data or whatever it is you're trying to actually work with. And then you've got your recipe, which is all of those instructions and the algorithm essentially that you use to put the food together into something. But that's not all you need to actually share food with someone in the future, right? So you need to actually have someone there to cook it or a machine that can cook it or something like that. So you've got lots of different pieces here. And so with Jupyter Notebooks, which contain code and incorporate data and require lots of different dependencies, what you need to do is be able to think about these things in kind of different levels or degrees of preservation. So our primer focuses on kind of giving 3 different ways that you can think about what you're curating and to base those curatorial activities and what information you're actually trying to gather on the expectations of the depositor. So next slide. So depending on what your depositor anticipates people to be able to do in the future with what they're giving you, they're going to have to provide to you different degrees of comprehensive metadata. So there are standards that we point people towards in the primer, like code meta and CSS, and lots of different specifications. So again, I didn't think we'd actually have much time to talk. But the real take home that I'm hoping people take from this is that you have to figure out whether or not when you're accepting Jupyter Notebooks, if you're accepting Jupyter Notebooks, to what degree are you capable of actually providing schemas in your repositories that accommodate these different degrees of metadata and these different expectations? So it's one thing to ask people to provide this information for you, but is it actually the kind of thing that is indexable and incorporated into your schema such that it's not going to be corrupted by its ingest? That, by saying that, what I mean is what you want your curatorial activities to be doing is to in no way be diminishing the capability that's being provided to you by a depositor. And so you also have to consider with all of these things whether or not these are supplements to something else and whether or not they are self-contained, meaning are these notebooks running code that is going to rely on external APIs or cloud computing resources? They often are. to what degree are you going to try to accommodate that level of functionality? Because you cannot expect people to be able to use something in the future if the metadata doesn't tell them how, and if your archive can't provide access to the tools they need to do that. So next slide. Repository suitability is then a big issue. So with these various levels of curatorial attention that you might have to give to a Jupyter notebook to actually have it meet the depositor's expectations, you have to be able to both kind of work with them when you're given that information, but also to understand when you're not necessarily like the suitable repository for this kind of object or set of objects. So kind of deciding whether or not you're the right place is a big part of this. But then next slide. There's a lot of other things. So in lieu of coming up with like really comprehensive set of questions and answers and whatnot for everything, what we did with our primer is we walked through a couple of flow charts actually for curatorial processes with all of the contingencies that you might want to consider given different situations. So whether or not you're given something that might already have a software DOI assigned to it, whether or not it's something that's already attached to other records, whether or not you're actually expected to have like a Docker container or something to go with this. All of those things keep us in this sort of loop where no matter what you do, I'm personally kind of convinced that all of the software will break, but what we really want are very good tombstones for everything. I'm convinced we just need really good tombstones because we're always going to need to reformat something. But to whatever extent possible, you want to ensure the functionality that others have accommodated for you. So next slide. So yeah, we basically have a draft of this, which includes those flowcharts and you know, hopefully all of this is very helpful. I had a few people who actually wrote some of the papers that we refer to within the primer actually look this over. So Dan Katz and Neil Chu Hong, so the director of the US Supercomputing Facility and the director of the Software Sustainability Institute both gave really wonderful feedback on this, and I'm still waiting for some feedback from the American Astronomical Society, an editor who works on software publications. So hopefully with all of that incorporated feedback, we have something that's really helpful, but we did still have these questions. So I'm happy to just kind of stop here. And if you've got feedback on any of these questions, I'd be really excited to hear your thoughts.
Well, that was a wonderful presentation and very good considerations. Thank you, Dana. The next group is going to be SPSS.
Hello, can everyone hear me? This is Joshua. Yes?
We can hear you.
Thank
yes.
you. Sorry, I don't like talking into the void. I need to know listening. I
know, everybody wants verbal confirmation. I get it.
Thank you. Yeah, so we were part of the SPSS group. Sort of like Jupyter Notebooks and maybe some of these other formats we're talking about, you know, SPSS isn't really a file format. It's a software that can sort of work with and produce many different file types. So I think the most important part about sort of our consideration was first to think of, okay, well, what are all the file types that are produced by SPSS or that SPSS can read, and which are the important ones to sort of focus on. As a sort of second thing for sort of curation is thinking about, because SPSS files can contain both the data, meaning the sort of observations or the rows of data, but also metadata about each of those variables and what they mean. But there's also syntax files and output files, which can also be important to know. So trying to make sure that the people with the primer know all the kind of components you need to sort of put something back together very clearly, and knowing sort of where to find metadata. So if you get for example, if you get a .sav file and you don't get a README, you might think, oh no, I can't use this. I don't know what's going on. But if you actually open the file, you'll see, oh, the metadata is actually contained in that file. So kind of laying out the expectations for what you might see with different types of SPSS data. We also wanted to talk about sort of the preservation actions or recommendations. So we looked at a few organizations. So we looked at recommendations from the Library of Congress. We looked at what ICPSR recommends for SPSS formats. And then I believe we looked at GASIS and some other sort of institutions and data repositories around the world, just to kind of get some recommendations for how they handle it, because I feel like they've already dealt with this problem, so why are we going to try to start over from scratch? So let's see what other people have considered. And so part of that preservation action is to consider, like, do you convert this or not? You know, do we need the plain text, or do we leave it in the proprietary format? And so some of the other things we sort of considered for curation was being aware of what version of SPSS the data is in. Like many software, data created in older versions of SPSS might not be readable in newer versions. In particular, everything that came before, I think, version 19 is sort of questionable. So being aware of how old the file is and what version it is, and making sure that you probably note that somewhere is very important. And of course, we also interviewed researchers because we wanted their feedback on how they typically interact with SPSS and SPSS files. So if you want to go to the next slide just sort of addresses the primer highlights. So how did we deal with these curation considerations? So for the file type sort of problem issue, we sort of decided that in general, the SAV format and the POR, the portability format, were the ones that we were going to focus on. But we included an appendix with detailed information about all the different file types that are native to SPSS, so that if you get those other file types, you'll know, oh, this is actually part of SPSS. This isn't some other sort of software or anything. So we focused on the SAV format and the POR. And just so if folks aren't familiar, SAV would be the typical sort of data format of an SPSS file, so the data and the metadata, so the variable labels and things like that. And the POR format is portability, and so that's meant to be sort of a more plain text version of SPSS data with the metadata that can be opened in different versions of SPSS. So it's slightly more flexible, but it's still not necessarily as open as a CSV would be. And so thinking about data and the metadata, like what are we keeping, we sort of tried to make recommendations on, you know, as far as what metadata would be necessary for future reuse. Of course, I feel like this is probably typical amongst most repositories, as far as you would want to know the label names, and you would want probably a code book, or if it's a survey, you would want a questionnaire. So a lot of those were typical for maybe lots of different data types. But I think the specifics for SPSS would be thinking about those syntax files. Syntax files would be SPSS files, or excuse me, files that kind of contain the steps that you took to analyze or edit your SPSS data. So if you think of the data as a SAV file, the syntax file would kind of be like the code that runs on the data. So that would be kind of like your code versus the data, which would be the SAV. So it's kind of important to know that, I guess I need Dana's slide here, that code is not data, that you need to know that these two are different, but they kind of, you can't really use the syntax file if you don't have the data. and you won't know the analysis that people did if you just have data. You need the syntax as well. The third thing was making recommendations for preservation actions. Again, we looked at a lot of different repositories and what they recommended, and most of them, pretty much all of them, said they will happily take the original format, the SAV format, but at some point, whether it's the researcher or the curator, would then transform that into a CSV or a plain text as well. Since SPSS is proprietary, there isn't necessarily a guarantee, of course, that it will be around forever. So kind of creating that CSV version as a sort of a backup, really at the point when you receive it, like as soon as possible, is really important, you know, obviously just in case something happens. And that's also something to point out in particular, that of course a CSV file won't have as much metadata as that original file has. So having something like a code book as well to explain what those variables mean is also important. And that's one thing that we actually learned from our researcher interviews, was that researchers do tend to use SPSS to create their code books, because SPSS will create a code book for you very easily with just a click of a button. So that's actually really nice to hear that they're taking advantage of that, and hopefully that would be deposited with their data. But to be aware that you can actually very quickly create code books from SPSS files is sort of important for the curators as well. And then the last couple things I say we'll point out that we added in the primer was just that we had some links to some SPSS tutorials, and also some information on the different types of software you can use to transform SPSS files if you don't have SPSS or you can't afford it. And then we also, of course, included a bibliography just in case you wanted all the information that we had gathered. Thank you.
That was great, Joshua. Thank you. It sounds like you got a lot out of the interviews. The next group is going to be MS Access.
All right. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Excellent. Okay, so Dave and I worked on looking at MS Access databases and how, you know, some issues that might come up with opening them, preserving them, and so forth. So curation components, some of the key things that we looked at were, you know, how do you even open the things, right? So you're going to need basically a Windows PC. There's no access for Mac, which may or may not work, because even if the file extension is like MDB or ACCDB, there can be many subversions of those formats. So like basically every Access database from like Access 2000 up to like 2016, they all have or can have MDB extensions, but the underlying format could be different. So just because there's an MDB file that you need to open, there's no guarantee that it'll work in recent versions of Access. So the most critical thing would be that we identified is, like, you know, exporting to a flat CSV file is better than nothing, just because, you know, Access is a proprietary format. There are so many variables that may cause it to open or not open properly. But of course, the downside is that you're going to lose a lot of the, well, you're going to lose basically the entirety of that relational part of the relational database. So when it comes to preservation, it's better than nothing, but there's going to be some data loss. So in terms of preservation, we really didn't identify, you know, like a standard for preservation, although there are some tools available. So this SIARD standard or format is something that's being developed out of a project called eARC, which is a European funded research project in which they're partnering with various you know, public and private organizations in Europe to do preservation of different things. Associated with that project, there's a company in Portugal that is developing a database preservation toolkit, actually is what they call it, where they are using this SIARD format and exporting databases into XML. We didn't really look too much in depth into this tool or this format, but it's one of the future questions that we added to the primer. But it would be a lot of work for a curator to actually go through and convert it to this kind of format. Unless it's going to be something that's really useful for super long-term archiving. And of course, then that would only capture the database files themselves. It wouldn't capture any like scripts or macros.
Hi, Deb, it's Jennifer.
Or code or forms that are associated with.
I was wondering, I have a thing in 142 in a little bit, and I was wondering.
JM, can you mute yourself?
Yes, am I not muted?
You're not. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, everybody. I just remembered something that I didn't do.
Okay, so we did look at a bunch of examples, and because Access is so broad and it's being used for so many different things, most things that we found were not really curated in any way. So we didn't really have much to draw in there. The best examples that we found were ones from TDAR, where they actually present things in a very nice way. So they have, if you click on those links, I don't know if these are, okay, these aren't clickable, but you can actually click on them in the slides in Google Drive. They actually extract the table headings and some metadata from the databases and present it in a really nice way. Next slide. So a couple of highlights from the primer. Actually, the Library of Congress has a really good compendium on kind of more the technical aspects of the Access format. So for the initial part of our primer, we mostly drew on their work to kind of explain the different versions and what you can open in which versions and so forth. The database documenter, this is a tool that's included in Access that is really, really useful from a curation point of view. So what it does is it basically extracts all the column information, data types, all the relationships from the database and exports it into a PDF file. So it's kind of like a first pass to understand what's going on. This is probably the thing to run. Of course, that depends, the level of usefulness for this depends on if the researchers themselves have made use of the built-in Access metadata fields, such as descriptions of tables, descriptions of the columns themselves. So if they haven't made use of that, a lot of that information is going to be empty. But at least it's a good way to kind of get a really quick overview of what's in the database. Related to documentation, so the database documenter will tell you what tables are related to what other tables, but it doesn't tell you what those relationships mean. So from a curation point of view, you want to make sure that those are documented in some way. Then we looked a little bit at tools for accessing Access DBs outside of Access itself, and these are fairly limited. So there are a few, but they're really not robust, and they're not going to capture a lot of the stuff that you can with Access itself. Like, for example, any sort of forms that were created in the program itself. And another big challenge related to Access that may or may not happen with like other databases like geodatabases is that there can be tables that are not stored in the database locally. They can be linked out to remote servers. So checking for that during the curation process is important. And Access does have an option to turn these remote tables into local tables. So that could be useful to make a kind of a self-contained package. And this doesn't even touch the whole thing where if the table lives in a remote server, and it's not locally savable, like what do you do in those cases? So I think that was all we wanted to talk about. So yeah, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to add them.
Thank you, Fernando. That was great. The next group is going to be Microsoft Excel.
Hi, everyone. This is Sandra Sawchuk talking. So the great thing about doing a primer on Excel is that most people know or think that they know about Excel already. So if you could advance the slide, that'd be great. But what we discovered in our group was that there were gaps in our knowledge. And there were things that some of us didn't know or that we hadn't considered. So it was really an interesting exercise doing a primer on a product that the majority of us use regularly. Things that we discovered or determined is the first point. Obviously, Excel is widely used in the natural and social sciences, and these files are often found and deposited into data repositories. Some examples of the types of files that might be deposited: files that contain tabular data, files that use macros, and in many ways almost are like running a program to analyze data that's been entered. Excel files can contain images, and they can also be used for a number of different really creative things. So it was quite interesting to discuss all the different possibilities for Excel files. One issue with Excel is how proprietary the format is. It's not just proprietary as a standalone product, but the long-term reusability is impacted by legacy versions of itself. So there can be problems in opening older versions of Excel files. There are, cross-platform problems. Until very recently, the 2016 release of Excel for Mac, there were, and there still are, differences between the Mac and PC versions. Notably, some differences include the 1900 versus the 1904 date encoding. So something that I learned, I always knew that Excel was strange with dates, but Excel actually stores dates as a specific serial number, and that serial number is calculated by counting, I believe, the number of days from either the year 1900 or the year 1904, which is kind of bizarre. So something that in a curatorial sense needs to be considered deeply is the age and the version and the format of the file itself. As well, there are many different types of Excel files. So obviously, the standard Excel file is something that we would recognize, but Excel files can contain macros, and then there's a number of different file extensions that go along with that. So depending on the type of file, and luckily the file extension is a major clue for that, there may be other related issues. We discussed at length the consideration of converting Excel files to CSV. That obviously is preferable for curation because it's essentially plain text and in many ways human readable. But because Excel can be used in so many different ways, it's really not always possible. One major drawback of the conversion to CSV, even for files that have tabular data in them, is that a CSV file can only be created out of one worksheet at a time. So when we think about an Excel file as a workbook with a number of sheets contained in them, when we convert to CSV, we're really missing out on a lot of structural information about that file. In addition, Excel files can reference other worksheets or workbooks. So in that case, there would be obvious problems in the conversion process. So all of these things are issues that need to be understood, before the deposit can happen. Excel can also be fussy when opening, even though it's such a commonly used program. Opening files can be difficult, specifically if the files have macros. Macros are code, essentially, that can either be these pieces of code, and as we've discussed together here, code is not data, but some Excel files with macros require the code or the macro file to be authentic and to be complete. And in some cases, these bits of macro code can actually be stored locally on the depositor's computer and not accompany the file at all. So that can be an issue if there's not an opportunity to get in touch with the depositor. Also, an issue that we already discussed was the linking between other workbooks or worksheets. So if there are external references contained in formulas or in other ways within the Excel file, if they do not accompany the original file, then there's a problem there as well. There also is no metadata standard for Excel, so detailed documentation is strongly encouraged. Documentation about the purpose of the file, if it's tabular data, what the variable names are, and all of those things that we would need to know. So we recommend, if possible, or as a way to train future depositors, that Excel users, when they want to curate their data, get in touch with metadata librarians so that they can incorporate some, discipline-specific metadata to describe the information within the file. So yeah, we've definitely discovered a lot about Excel that we didn't know necessarily all together as a group. And they do demonstrate that they are, in fact, in some cases, complex curatorial endeavor. If we can go to the next slide. So I really struggled to understand what highlights meant. So this is just...
Sorry about that. My
That's
fault.
okay. So this is just a breakdown of our table of contents for the primer itself. So we spent, as you can see, the bulk of the primer discussing both the format itself and what it does, as well as what to look for. And there are connections between, problems opening the file and content problems that really mirror and describe some of the typical purpose and functions of Excel. So we've really tried to break down in a very precise way as many of the different ways in which we believe Excel could be used, which was an interesting exercise. And then, we broke down what could go wrong with each of those typical purposes and functions. We have provided some clues for software for viewing and analyzing the data. There are definitely different kinds of programs that can be run to understand the contents of an Excel file, and Excel itself provides some add-ons specifically for Windows users to help understand the contents of the file. Obviously it's a curatorial preservation primer, so we discussed potential actions, and then Greg really brilliantly made us this curate checklist, which follows all the steps of the DCN's checklist. So we feel that we've really learned a lot about Excel, and we hope that we can help you learn about Excel too. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. That was very thorough, and I love that you incorporated the curate checklist. The next group is going to be WordPress.com.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you, Hannah, for putting together a title slide there. I have been struggling with being ready to share this because I feel like every time I'm about to feel confident about it, then I go down another rabbit hole. So important things from the process at this point, and Lisa Johnston has been a very patient and wonderful mentor as I work through this. Starting from the baseline curation question, if somebody were to want to deposit a website that was built with WordPress, do they mean that they're using the free open source WordPress.org software, which they've then hosted on their own servers, perhaps paid for a domain name, and maybe edited the code and built upon it? That is possible, although we agreed as I was working through this that that's probably the lesser frequent situation, that most people are going to WordPress because of the low threshold for technical knowledge, and therefore they're probably using the WordPress.com hosted option. That then leaves still two, well, actually more than two, but two basic first questions. Were they paying for WordPress.com, in which case they may have some different options around plugins and customization in the business account format, or in the free version, the completely free version of WordPress.com, there's going to be very little that they can control. So working from the baseline, at this moment, the primer is really focused on the basic free WordPress.com account. And that is partially because I don't have a lot of access to testing out other versions of a paid site. So I just don't know exactly how some of these different features are going to show up in the export. But what I've been focusing on is what's the option within WordPress.com for exporting the site, and how might that deposit look? Certainly one of the first questions would be, is there going to be any sort of a scan or capture of the image of the live site? Because the export comes out in an XML file. And so all of the layout is essentially lost. You don't get your CSS files, you don't get any of the files that sort of build the site live. It's just a content export in XML. And then any media that's been uploaded is exported separately. And that comes out in a tar file that's just zipped together, but they come out in their native formats. So that could be a wide variety of what's going to come out of there and how that might then live in wherever the next place is. Most of what I'm finding and all of the conversations that I'm reading are really about importing that elsewhere, right? Just migrating the site to somewhere else. I have not found a lot of conversations about the deposit and the curation of that. So I've been going down a couple different paths. Certainly there's some documentation that's going to need to come from the depositor, no matter how the deposit happens, and I'll follow up on that in a second. At the baseline, there's not really a lot of metadata that comes out in that XML, at least not background metadata, and there's no version control metadata. So while you can see the logins of the authors that have participated on the site, there's no information about who's the lead creator on the site. There's not a key, so you would need a key as to what that login then translates to as a real person for an author. And any tracking of the site moving between domains or having major content edits is not reflected in the XML. What is reflected at most is anything that's currently in a draft mode. So sometimes there's content on the XML that's not on the live site because it hadn't been in publish mode. Yeah. How to do the deposit is another question. There are two options that I can see so far, because the export has to be run from inside the account of the holder of the site, and there's only one way to do it. Either the depositor is going to run the export for the curator and then hand over the files, or there could be it might be worthwhile for a curator to have their own WordPress account, and they could transfer the administration of the site. That's really a question of what's going to happen with the live site afterwards. Is there an intention that it's going to keep running? Is it going to come down? Is it simply going to live but not be updated? What are the goals for how this is being deposited? Is there a hope that this will actually be visually replicable? Or is this just, we need the text content and the files, and maybe they'll be reused in some other way in the future? So those are some of the major questions and major hiccups that have kept me going down different rabbit holes as we go through it. There are some other questions, though, still going, and this is where the primer is definitely in draft mode. So if you can go forward, Hannah. Okay, so problems with the primer, ongoing questions. When you look at the header of the document, there are multiple namespaces being employed in the XML document. One of them is Dublin Core, and that object opens very nicely and you can see the elements. Another is Well-Formed Web, and there's a great GitHub collection that explains the elements of that namespace. But the actual WordPress proprietary XML namespace, I can't find. No one seems to really be pointing to it, and a lot of people seem to not think it matters. It's a question for me as I think about how would potentially a future researcher want to use this as a text data collection for text mining and needing to map those elements. Now, I've been talking to some digital humanists who thought that they could work up a quick workaround in Python, but I'm not sure that that really, I'm not quite ready to let go of this as a question is the resource there that would be useful to curators. I mentioned again too, the business account is going to allow for third-party plugins to work with the site, and how those get reflected in the XML document is not clear to me, and there's going to be a wide variety there. The question again is going to be, how much will it matter in the future reuse of the data and the FAIR principles? What is really going to be lost or need translation going forward? Sometimes those plugins are simply going to be, moderators of comments or sharing features, and they might not affect the actual content of the site, but that's not to say that's always the case. And then I've been reading a lot of things about the interoperable problems of XML, and how even when people are using the same XML structures, sometimes the translation between systems does not work well, and this is certainly something repositories have been worried about for a while. It's really, I'm just sometimes lost in the game of trying to guess at how someone might want to use this collection and try to prepare for it as well as possible. So that's where I'm at right now. But like I said, I'm just not quite comfortable ever letting go of it and turning it over. I feel like there's always another thing I have to figure out. Oh, and there's an inclusion in the primer about some tools out there that can take the WordPress formatted XML and turn it into a PDF, which preserves at least some of the layout, but that does select only certain content. So there's content loss in that PDF. Yes, it's more user readable, but it really seems like any useful deposit of this would also need to have those scans of the site itself. So that's where I'm at with that so far.
That's great information. Thank you, Heather. The next group is R, and Cynthia is going to be speaking for Monica.
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly run through this. Monica actually switched jobs halfway through this process, so she didn't get as far as she was hoping to with this R Markdown primer. So R Markdown is just, R Markdown documents are fully reproducible. It's similar to like the Jupyter notebooks that were discussed earlier. They use a productive notebook interface to weave together like narrative text and code to then produce like an output. And you can actually include multiple languages or programming languages in there, such as R, Python, and SQL. And so we just put in like a screenshot of the primer as it stands now because it is still in process. So she did some great work in kind of pulling out some key questions for curation review. And further down, if you look at the full document, she has some stuff to look for as a curator. The webinar is being recorded and it'll be shared later. So if you guys have to go, it's totally understandable. As far as the R Markdown primer goes, she did also articulate a number of README requirements that would be really useful since it is code as opposed to data. And so just because we're low on time, I'm gonna leave this and then allow Amanda to get to the next one. And if folks have questions, when they go and look at this, they're more than welcome to follow up with Monica or I.
Hello.
And now I turn it over to Amanda.
Thank you. So this one will be pretty short. So, and it's a very different story than everyone else has had so far. And in the sense that after doing my interviews and doing some work on this, I decided it actually wasn't worth creating a primer for. So a very different ending, but I still think a useful story. So I'm just going to share it as briefly as I can. So I was looking at CZI files, which is an image file type that is specific to confocal laser scanning microscopy on Carl Zeiss confocal microscopes. And so what confocal microscopy is basically a form of microscopy where you are able to look through a three-dimensional object, a small cell, obviously something sort of transparent, a developing larvae or an egg, for example, and take image slices through the depth of the entire organism. So what you end up with is basically a stack of images that allow you to go up and down through an individual. So as you can imagine, these are very high resolution, very large size files, and then the image itself is proprietary because it's connected with lots of metadata associated with settings on the microscope and so on. And so I thought, having known this group here at Hopkins that has a confocal scope that takes these images, that they have lots of problems managing the files that come off of this scope. And I knew it was proprietary. And so I thought, based on what I knew then, that it would be a good topic for a primer. After my conversations with them, it became clear that the largest source of frustration for them in using this instrument largely had to do with data management issues. And then I thought, oh, well, if that's just a classic RDS issue, maybe I don't need a primer. So I checked in with my group and I checked in with Lisa, who's been a really great mentor. And she said, well, focus on, the approach a curator would take with these files. And I thought, oh, right, of course, I'm supposed to be doing the curator. So, okay. And so then I went back to the group and interviewed them again and said, if you were going to share these CZI files, what would that look like? And I sort of tried to do the interview again, and they stopped me and they basically said, we don't ever share these files. We don't know anyone who does share these files, and we don't know why anyone would share these files, basically. So when they need to share images, they basically export them all to TIFF, and they might share the one or two parts of the slice that are useful. And they can imagine a scenario where you might want to share the whole stack, seeing that, imagining someone might want to look at a different section of the animal than they were interested in. But in that case, again, they would just share the stack of TIFFs. And so it turned out that my assumption that they would even want to share the CZI file itself was a bad assumption. And so then I just decided, well, okay, I need to rethink, step back. Maybe a better way to go would be to look at a primer on curating image files or something. And then just the thought of such a broad topic sent me, had to go take a walk. So that's where we're at. So I abandoned the idea of the CZI primer. I think I'm really glad I looked into it. I had really good conversations with this research group. And I think there haven't been any cases in my career as a librarian where I've walked away from something and decided, this is actually not a good course of action to take. And so it was actually really useful for me to be able to reach that conclusion and sort of be okay with it. Feel like I made a decision where I was being more productive by saying no. So that's my story.
Thank you, Amanda. Although it didn't result in a primer, I think you gathered some really good information about this particular topic and community and how we might serve them. So we are at the end right now and we are over time. So we were going to share about the primer peer review process, but we're actually going to put that out in mail. So you will be getting that from us very soon. Thank you everyone for joining us today and for sharing and presenting. Did you want to say anything, Cynthia?
No, just to echo that we'll send those, how that might work or how it's going to work out shortly. And if anybody has any questions with any of that or other thoughts, they should feel free to reach out. And thank you all for this awesome work. This is like so very exciting. And I am totally looking forward to using some of these for the curation we're doing here too. So you'll be hearing from us shortly. Thank you again.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Mm-hmm.